Hello everyone, Alex here from warnoffkeys.com, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can set up one-time passwords using Google Authenticator inside of AWS Cognito. So to get started, if you look inside the video description, you'll see a GitHub repository. This will include all of the previous files that I've worked on for my Cognito videos. You can go ahead and clone that to follow along. You can code from scratch, however I highly recommend that you do clone this, because we do have some utility functions such as this file here, more specifically, that's going to help us out a whole lot. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make a new component. This will be called MFA.JS. We're going to import React. We're then going to export a default component. And this is simply going to return a div that just says MFA. We're then going to save that inside of our main file. We're going to import this. And then we're going to render it at the bottom. So if we save this and we start our app with npm run start, we then see the component right here, which is MFA. We're going to go ahead and make this look a little bit more consistent. And again, just like in the previous videos, I'm not focusing on styling whatsoever. I'm just focused on the functionality. So of course, everything is going to look ugly. So within here, we're going to create an H1, say multi-factor authentication. And we're going to want to import a few more things from React. So we want useEffect, useState, and useContext. We're also going to want to import the account context, which is going to be a file that allows us to get Cognito user sessions as well as log people in and things like that. We'll take a look at the relevant stuff here in a few seconds. So we're going to import account context from accounts. And then we're wanting to gain access to one specific function called getSession. So we're going to use the useContext hook. We're going to pass in the account context. So if we hold Control and left click on account context, it'll open up this right here. And if we look at this getSession method, it is going to return some information such as the users, some headers using our API keys and authorization tokens, the sessions, the user attributes, and things like that. This is something I cover in previous videos in more detail. However, you don't necessarily need to know all the ins and outs of this function for this exact video. We'll be doing some edits to this function, so it's important that you have access to it, which is why you should have cloned from the GitHub repository. However, I'll explain those edits once we get to that point. For now, we can close this. And we're going to want to create three functions. The first one is going to be called getQRCode. The second one is going to be enable-mfa. And the third one is going to be disable-mfa. We're also going to want to create some state variables. So one will be user code and set user code. So this is going to be the state variable and also the function to update that state variable. We're going to use the useState hook with an empty string as the default. This is going to be the 6-digit authentication code that Google Authenticator, the actual application, will give us so we can actually verify our user. The next one is going to be enabled and set enabled. This is going to be whether MFA is enabled or not. We're going to call useState, the default value be false. The next one will be image and set image. We're going to call a Lambda function, which we'll create, and that Lambda function is going to return a image value that will be used as a source inside of an image. This is going to be the actual QR code. So for now, we're just going to have an empty string. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get a QR code. And so in order to do that, we're going to first want a button. We're going to say onClick equals get QR code. We're going to say enable MFA. So to do that, we're going to open up our Lambda folder. If you don't have one, then just create a folder called Lambda. We're going to create 3 different Lambda functions because a lot of this functionality is best done on the back end. We're going to then hook up API gateway to securely connect to those Lambda functions. And I'll show you guys how to do all of that within this video. So if we go to another console I have here, I am inside Lambda. And we have a basic Lambda function that I created in a previous video. We don't have to worry about this. We can close it. However, I don't want to have it right there inside the Lambda function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a directory. This one's going to be called create API key, which is what we had previously. And I'm going to drag index.js and package.json into there. Then I'm also going to create a few more directories here. So one will be called getQRCode. Another one will be called validate-mfa, which will actually make sure if our 6-digit token is correct. The last one would be called disable-mfa, which will remove it from our account so we don't have to log in using Google Authenticator every time. So if we do ls, we see that those are our functions and everything seems to be working. So if we go into get QR code, we navigate into there in our console, we can initialize the node project using npm init-y. And then I can also go in here, right click and make a new index.js file. We're going to make a main function. This will be an asynchronous function, which will have one parameter, which is event. And we're going to start this function by simply console logging what the event is. This way in our CloudWatch logs, we'll be able to actually see what information is being passed to the Lambda function. Very helpful for debugging some things. And for now, we're just going to return an empty string. Now, in order for Lambda to have actual access to this function, we need to do exports.handler equals main. And now this is the basic boilerplate for our Lambda function. Now we want to do is actually implement our own functionality. So we're going to import AWS, which I have installed globally on my machine. But if you don't, you can do that through npm install-g aws-sdk. And if you don't want to install it globally, you can remove the -g. However, I suggest installing it globally because whenever you're using Lambda, the AWS SDK package is included by default whenever it's actually ran on the Lambda servers. So there's actually no need to upload your own AWS installation. We want to get access to a QR code, so we can use the QR code package, and we do have to install this. So inside of our console, we can run npm install QR code. And then we need to gain access to a Cognito object. So we're going to create a constant called Cognito. There's going to be new aws.cognito service provider. Now this is going to take an object as a parameter. And one of the required things we need is to tell it where our user pool lives. So if we go into AWS, we see that this is my user pool right here, and I'm in the North Virginia region, which is US East 1. So if we go back to our code, we can say region US-East-1. Now I'm going to make a function called getQRCode. And this is what we're going to return right here in the main function. So this is going to be an asynchronous function. It's going to have one parameter, which is going to be access token, and it's camel case just like this for a reason. So this is going to simply return a new promise with resolve and reject. So now we need to use Cognito.associate software token. And this is going to have the first option to be a object here. We're going to have to pass in the access token. So what this is going to do is it's going to tell Cognito that this user using the access token, it'll understand what user, that this user is going to want to have a multi-factor authentication enabled using Google Authenticator or a similar app. So we're going to get a callback here with an error and a result. So if there's an error, we're going to reject with the error. Otherwise, we are going to create a string. This one's going to be called a URI. And we're also going to create a string called name. The name will be worn off keys, but you would typically name this whatever your application is. This is going to be the name that your users will see on the Google Authenticator app. So the URI is going to be OTP auth : TOTP / and then we're going to use this string here. We're going to use the name. We're actually going to decode the URI. So this will be able to add in the proper spacing and all that stuff. Then we're going to have a question mark, which will symbolize that we're now going to add parameters to here. The secret. And we are going to say results.secretcode. So we can console log this. So whenever we're running this, we get a better idea of what we're actually using. But this is a specific string designed for using the QR code system. So we can say qr.toDataURL. We can pass in the URI and we get a callback with error and result. So with this, we can do if error, we're going to reject with the error. Otherwise, we're going to resolve with the result. So now our QR code has a parameter of access token, but we're not actually passing that in. So we can say event.accessToken, and this one will have a lowercase a. So that is important to note. We can save this. We can right click on one of our files, reveal in File Explorer. We're going to select everything, and we're going to send this to a .zip. The reason why we're doing this is because we need to upload not just our code, but we actually need to upload the QR code module as well, which can be found in here. So now that we have our .zip, I'm going to copy this path here. We can close this and we can go over to Lambda. So go to AWS, under Services, you can type in Lambda. Open this in a new tab. We're then going to create a function at the top right. We're going to call this getQRCode. And our execution role will be a very basic Lambda role. that will simply just give us access to log things to CloudWatch. So we can click on create function. Once it's created, you'll see this basic template here. However, obviously we don't want this code. Under actions, you can click on upload a zip file, click on upload. We can navigate to the folder and select our .zip file. Clicking on save should upload it. Now what we need to do is we need to go to services. I'll need to type in API gateway. We're going to open this in a new tab, and we're going to actually continue off of an API that I created for the Cognito series previously. So if we go to API gateway, we can go to my tutorial API, and we're going to want to create a new method, or actually a new resource. So we're going to call this MFA. This is going to be the API endpoint that we want to actually reach in order to actually call our Lambda functions. So we want to enable API gateway course. We want to create the resource. So we now see on the left here, we're going to create a few different methods in here, but the first one is going to be a get method. So under actions, create method, you can then click on the drop down and select get. And then we can enter the Lambda function. We called ours get QR code. So if you do get QR code, you should see it there. Click on save, you'll get this prompt. This will just give this Lambda function or API gateway access to invoke this Lambda function. So under the designer, we see no triggers here, but once we click OK, and it's going to save and get that set up. If you go back to Lambda and we refresh, we now see API gateway here, which essentially means API gateway has access to actually invoke this Lambda function, which is what we want. So going back to API gateway, we can now set this up. We're going to start at the bottom left under method response. We're going to set a basic header here. This is going to be access-control-allow-origin. This will be inside the description, so you can easily copy and paste it. However, I do suggest you type it out just so you have the ability to remember it. Click on the check mark. We can go back to method execution here. Now going to the bottom right, we can go to integration response. We can expand this and expand the header mappings. We see the response header we just created. We want to set a value to it. So we can click on the edit pencil right here. We can type in single quote, star, single quote, and click save. Now we can click on back. We can go to method request. And then here we want to specify the authorization. So in order for a user to actually update their MFA settings, we want to ensure that they're logged in. So to do this, we can go to authorization and select Cognito. Then we can save it. We want API key required to be true. We can save that. URL query string parameters. If we expand this, we can add our access token with a lowercase a and a capital T. We can then click on the check mark. We can click on required. This will throw an error to the actual client or the website whenever this API is called without the access token. We see we get a warning here, and essentially we just have to go to a request validator. We have to validate all of these things right here. So technically you only need the query string parameters and headers. However, I like to validate everything that I can, just so if I add something in the future, I don't have to worry about updating the setting. So we can select that, click on the check mark. Going back to method execution, one last thing is the integration request. So if we scroll down, we see mapping templates. And this is how we can actually configure the query string parameters to then be sent into that event object, which we see in our Lambda function right here. So in order to do that, we have to create a new mapping template, and we want to specify the recommended one. Whenever there are no mapping templates defined, we can then add a mapping template, call it application/JSON. It's important that it's named this exact thing. Click on the check mark. Scrolling down, we're going to create a JSON-like syntax, and we're going to say access token. And this is going to be the exact variable and the exact object that we're going to see inside of our function. So because this is access token with lowercase a and capital T, we need the exact same thing over here. But the value is going to be $input.params with parentheses and single quotes. And inside will be the actual query string parameter, which is the exact same thing, access token. So this is the string that we specified in the last window. And so I typically like to keep these the same just so it's consistent, easier to understand. But with this said, we can click on save. We can go back to actions and then deploy the API to the development stage. So now that this is deployed, we can go to our stages. We can expand the dev here and we see our GET request under MFA. If we click that, we get this invoke URL. We can right click and copy it. Going back to VS Code and going into our MFA object. So in here, we're going to want to first get the session, which will return the access token as well as other information such as the required headers, such as the API key and authorization tokens. So we can call get session. This is going to return a promise, so we can use .then. We're going to destructure the access token and the headers. And then we're going to say constant URI, and we're going to paste in this. We're then going to add a query string parameter of access token, which is lowercase a. This is the exact thing that we created back under our resources tab. If you go to our get request, method request, has to match this exact string right here. So we say access token equals, and then we're going to pass in the access token. For now, we're just going to console log the URI. And if we head over to our accounts file, or if we control click on the account context, it should jump us over there. We're not actually returning the access token. So we can create a constant called access token. This will be equal to session.accesstoken.jwt token. And then we can return that right here. So we can save this file. Going back here, we have access token. And sometimes I get an error where this is sometimes an object. So we can say if type of access token is exactly equal to string, or if it's not equal to string, then we're going to say access token equals access token.jwt token. And so with that said, we should get the proper access token. If we save this and go back to our website, we could then clear the console to make it cleaner for us to read. If we click on enable MFA, we get this URI right here. We can copy the link address and paste it in. We see our main endpoint, and then we see access token equals this giant thing right here, which is our access token. So with that said, we're able to actually call this using fetch. So we can say fetch URI. Inside of the options, we want to pass in the headers, which we destructured from here. And going back to our accounts, just to take a look at that again, we have our API key and our authorization token. So those are things that are required in order to log in, and they're required because we set it up that way. If we go back to API gateway and we're under method request, we see our authorization is Cognito, which is where the authorization token is required. And we see API key is required to true. So now that we're fetching this, we can use .then. This returns data. We can use data.json to get a more proper or readable format. And this also returns a promise, so we can use .then. We're going to console log that, .catch, and console.error. So if we save this and go back to our website, clear the console, enable MFA, and we see our endpoint, and then after a few seconds, we see an actual message, and this says an error. So if we look at it, it says software token MFA has not been enabled by the user pool. So to fix this, we can go back to our user pools. We can go to MFA and verifications. This is the multi-factor section at the top. We want this to be optional, and we want to select time-based one-time password. We can then scroll down and click on Save Changes. Going back to our app, if we try clicking Enable MFA again, we then see a more meaningful response, and this is going to be an actual image that we can use inside of the source. So with that said, we can go in and we can set image as the parameter here, and similar to console.log, this is going to pass in the result into this function. And so it's essentially going to be the same thing as doing this, set image data, same exact thing. But we're going to do this just because it's easier. And then the image will actually be set here, and we're going to use that as a source of an image soon. Now we want to actually update some of the JSX here. So we're going to have a few different conditionals. We're going to say if it's enabled, we are then going to add a div that says MFA is enabled. And inside of here, we're going to later on add a form to be able to disable multi-factor authentication. But otherwise, we're going to say if there's an image, then we're just going to have a div. And we're going to add some information in here in a second. And then otherwise, we're going to display the button that we had previously. So now that we are actually going to have an image, we want to actually render that to the screen. We're going to add a H3 tag. Well, it'll say scan this QR code. We're going to have an image. The source will be image, which is the value we have inside of our hook right here, our state. We're then going to add a form, and the on submit will be enable MFA. Inside here, we're going to have an input and a button. The input will have the value of user code. And whenever it is changed, we're going to get the event and we're going to set user code equal to event.target.value. This is simply just going to be the 6-digit code. We're going to set this to required. We're also going to set this to required, and then we want a button with the type of submit, and this is going to be called confirm code. So now, under enable MFA, we're going to get an event, which is going to be the actual form submission, and we want to prevent that. So prevent default, and for now we can just console log the user code. So user code is that. We save this, we go back here, we can enable MFA, we see our endpoint, and then it got a result, and this is the QR code right here. We can type in here, and so everything seems to be working. We type in random numbers, confirm code, we see it right there. So now the goal is to actually verify this. And so to do that, we're gonna have to create another Lambda function. If you go back to VS Code, we can minimize this and we see validate-mfa. We wanna navigate to that in our console. So I'm gonna go back, we use ls, we see it right there. So we can cd into the validate-mfa function. And then we can run npm init-y to initialize the project. And I can make a new index.js file. So similar to the other file, we're going to create a main function. This will be an asynchronous function with an event parameter. And we're going to console log the event parameter. And we're going to return an empty string. And then we can use exports.handler equals main to give Lambda actual access to this function. I'm then going to import AWS using require AWS SDK. And we want to create another Cognito object similar to the other file. So constant Cognito equals new AWS.Cognito identity service provider. We need to pass in our region, which is US East 1. That's just where my user pool is. Obviously, you'd want to enter your own region if it's different. And then we're going to create a function called validate-mfa. This is going to be an asynchronous function, user code and access token, and these are camel case, so they're going to have capitals at the beginning of the words. This is intended. And this function is going to return a new promise with resolve and reject. Now we're going to create a parameter object, and we're going to pass in the access token and the user code. And then we're going to say cognito.verify software token. We're going to pass in the params, which I misspelled. And then this gives us a callback with error and result. If there's an error, we're going to reject from the promise using the error. Otherwise, we're going to resolve using the result. And so here, instead of returning an empty string, we're going to return validate-mfa using event.usercode and event.access token. Notice that these start with a lowercase letter. That is intended. So we can save this. And because there's no third-party dependencies, we're just using AWS SDK, which is imported into Lambda by default. We can actually just copy this code, and we're going to go make a new Lambda function. So going back to Lambda, we can click back on functions. We can create a new function. We're going to call this validate-mfa. Scrolling down to the permissions, we can use an existing role, and we can use the default Lambda role, which just gives me access to CloudWatch. If we minimize the console, we can click on create function. And then we can go ahead and paste in our code here. Control S to save in the inline editor, and then click on save at the top right. So with that said, we can go back to API Gateway. Under resources, if we select MFA, we're going to create a new post method. So under actions, create method. Then on the dropdown, select post and click on the check mark. We can then type in the name, which is validate-mfa. If it doesn't show up, just type in the exact name, or if you're not sure, you can just copy and paste this. So if you click on save, click on OK, and that's what we see right here. So everything should be working. Going back, we're going to set the method response and integration response just like previous. So we're going to add a new header, access-control-allow-origin. Click on the check mark. Going back to integration response, going to expand this. Under header mappings, we're going to edit it with a wildcard right here. Going to save this. Going back to method request, we want to do similar stuff to previously on the GET request. So we want to specify the Cognito user pool as authorization. We want to validate the query string parameters, body and headers. And then we want to set API key required to true. Now, if you look inside the code, we have access to user code and access token. So we need access to those through the query string parameters. So we're going to create an access token. I'm going to click on the check mark, and we're going to create a user code and click on the check mark. Both of these are required. So we'll check those. If we go back, we can then click on integration request. We can go to mapping templates. And then whenever there's no templates defined, we can add a mapping template, call it application/JSON. And then inside, we're going to create another JSON-like syntax with the access token and the user code. So the values are exactly what we used before. So $input.params with parentheses and single quotes. And we're going to call this one access token. And then $input.params, parentheses, single quotes, user code. So this is going to create an object that goes directly into the event parameter, which is how we gain access to the actual events from the API query string parameters. So if we save this, go to Actions, Deploy API, select our development stage, and click on Deploy. We can then expand this. We can click on the post request, and then we can right-click the invoke URL and copy it. So going back to our code, under the MFA, we then want to get the session, which returns a promise. We're then going to destructure the access token and the headers. So we're going to say if type of access token is not exactly equal to string, then we're going to say access token equals access token.jwt token. Sometimes this is necessary, sometimes it's not from my experience, so I just like to be safe and just make sure we're getting the actual access token. So then we can create a URI using a template literal here, and we're going to do something very similar to above. So we can say access token equals access token and user code equals user code, which is our state object that we see right here. Now this is the same exact beginning. If I highlight it, you see that highlighted there as well. So what I can do is I can change this to an API variable that we can define here. So const API equals this. And then I can replace this right here with an actual API variable as well. So it just makes it a little cleaner. We're going to add a console log here. And this is mostly just so if it's calling the API multiple times due to a bug on our side, we actually see that in the console. And then we're going to go ahead and fetch the URI here. Now the method is going to be post because that's the actual method we configure this to under the post request. And then we need to pass in the headers. Similar to the last time we did this, .then, we get data. We want to convert it to a JSON form, which is going to be easier for us to work with. And this returns another promise. So .then, console.log, .catch, console.error. So if we save this and go back to our website, we can then click on enable MFA. We get this QR code. And so if I actually scan this using Google Authenticator, I see worn off keys inside of my app. And if I enter the code, which is 886729, obviously yours will be different. If we click on confirm code, we then get the status back, which is success. So that's good. So now what we want to do is we want to actually check if the response has status and if the response has the string success as a value. So inside of here, we're going to get our result. We're going to say if result.status, which has a capital S, and result.status is exactly equal to success. So what this says, we know everything worked. We're going to set enable to true. However, if it doesn't work, then we're going to have an error. And so if we go ahead and just console log the result, if we save this and we enter an invalid code, we'll be able to actually understand what to do with that. So if we click on enable MFA, we get this. I'm just going to enter random numbers. If we confirm this, we get an error. So here we see the error type is enable software token MFA exception. If I copy that and we go back to our else statement here, if we say if results.error type is exactly equal to this, then we can say alert incorrect 6-digit code. Another thing we want to handle is if we enter too many digits, if we click on confirm, we get a different error, which is invalid parameter exception. If I copy this, and I'm assuming that if I enter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5A, and we confirm the code, we're going to get similar, which we do. So if we go back, we can say else if result.error type is exactly equal to this. So this is checking if it's invalid parameter. We're then going to have an alert that'll say, please provide a 6-digit number. So if we save this, enable MFA, random numbers, too many of them, please provide a 6-digit number. And if we change this to actually 6 digits and confirm the code again, we then see incorrect 6-digit code. So that seems to be working. However, if I go back to my Google Authenticator app, and if I delete the previous secret that I had, and then I scan the QR code again, I can then enter the correct code, which is 669330. If I click on confirm code, we see MFA is enabled, which happens because we set enabled to true right here. However, now we need to tell Cognito that this user actually has a confirmed multi-factor authentication. So we're going to create an object called settings. We're going to say preferred MFA is true and enabled is true. We're then going to go back to our .then right here at the top, and we're going to gain access to a user object, which is something that is returned that we can see right here. This is the Cognito user. So now that we have access to the user, we can call user.setUserMFA preference. We can pass in null as the first object. The first object is going to be the SMS two-factor authentication settings, which we're not using, so we set null. The second option is going to be the settings for the time-based tokens, which is what we're using. So we pass in our settings object. The third parameter is going to be a callback, which is required. We don't actually care about any of the results here, so we're just going to create a basic anonymous function. Now, if we save this, we could then go back and enable MFA. And we see that we have to scan our QR code again. So if you remove the previous token from your Google Authenticator app, and then you scan the new QR code, this will be something that we can actually remember soon. We can then go in and enter our new code. Mine is 097641, confirm code. So it says MFA is enabled. However, if we refresh, it says enable MFA. So it doesn't actually remember that. So that's the next step. So to do that, if we go back to VS Code, we go to our accounts file, we're actually going to return this as a variable. So to get started, we have to import AWS from AWS SDK, and we need to create a Cognito attribute here. So const Cognito equals new AWS.Cognito identity service provider, pass in the region, US East 1. This is the same line of code that we've been using in our Lambda functions. And now we're going to say constant MFA enabled equals await new promise with resolve and reject. Actually, we just probably need to resolve here. So we need access to the access token. So if we move this line up here, we can say Cognito.getUser. We're going to pass in the access token with a capital A. We're going to use our local variable, which has a lowercase a. We're then going to have a callback with error and data. I say if there's an error, we're going to resolve with false. Otherwise, we're going to say resolve data.user MFA settings list. We want to make sure that that exists. And then we're going to say and data.user MFA settings list includes a string, which is software token MFA. So if both of those are true, then MFA is enabled. So we can now return MFA enabled inside of our resolve right here for the entire session. If we save this, we can go back to our file. And then if we scroll up to this top of our file, we can actually use effect. And this is going to be the equivalent to component did mount. So this is essentially code that's ran whenever our component is first rendered. And so with this, we want to get the session. We then want to use .then and get MFA enabled. And we want to say set enabled, MFA enabled. So if it's true, it'll set enabled to true. If it's false, it'll set enabled to false. And scrolling down, when it's enabled, it's going to say MFA is enabled. So if we save this, we go back, our application. Okay, so I just got this working. I noticed an error here. The access token shouldn't say get JWT token. It should say JWT token, just like this. And so with this said, then it works. So we see MFA is enabled. If we refresh, it automatically detects it and knows that MFA is enabled. So with that said, now whenever your users go to your settings dashboard, they're going to be able to disable MFA. So that's what we're going to do next. So if we go back into our MFA component here, we see MFA is disabled. We can change this to its own div. And then we're going to add a form. On submit will be disable MFA. We're going to have an input. This is going to be very similar to the previous input with the previous button. So I'm just going to copy and paste this code here. And then the button here will be disable MFA. So now with that said, this form is going to give us an event option. And we're going to say event.prevent default. And now we're going to want to call a disable-mfa Lambda function, which we have not written yet. So if we go into disable-mfa, if we navigate to that in our functions inside of our console, we can cd into disable-mfa. We can run npm init-y to initialize our project, and we can make a new index.js file. So similar to the previous ones, we can create a main function. This is an asynchronous function. It's going to have an event parameter. We're going to console log the event. We're going to return an empty string. We're then going to say exports.handler equals main to give Lambda access to this. We're then going to import AWS from AWS SDK. And we're going to create a Cognito object. So new AWS.Cognito identity service provider. Our region is US East 1. This is all the same code from previously. Now, one thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the MFA token is actually correct before we disable it. So we can go into validate-mfa and we can simply copy this function into here. We're then going to create a new function called disable-mfa. This is going to be an asynchronous function that passes in the user sub, and this is going to return a new promise with resolve and reject. We're then going to create a new parameter object. We're going to say the user pool ID, which we'll get in a second. The username is sub, keep in mind of the capitals, and then software token MFA settings. We'll say enabled is false. Notice the capitals here as well. Now that we have the parameters, we're going to call cognito.admin set user MFA preference. We're going to pass in the parameters and we get a callback, which gives us error and result. We're then going to say if there's an error, we're going to reject using that error. Otherwise, we're going to resolve using the result. And then inside of our main function, we want to start off by destructuring the access token, the sub, and the user code from the event object. We then want to create a constant called validated equals await validate-mfa. This requires the user code and access token. So we can pass that in, user code and access token. Then we can say if validated.status and validated.status is exactly equal to success. This obviously returns the same exact response as the Lambda function does, and so that's why we have the same if statement here. So if this worked, then we're going to return await disable-mfa, and this requires the sub, so we can pass that in. Otherwise, we're just going to return validated, which should be false. So if we save this, we then see we have no third-party dependencies, so we can simply copy this code. We're going to go into our Lambda functions, and we're going to create a new function called disable-mfa. We're going to go to permissions, execution role, Lambda default. We're going to click on create function. Once this is here, we can paste this in and click on save. We now want to go back to API gateway and want to go to resources. We're going to create our last endpoint here. So under MFA, we're going to go to create method, which will be delete. We then want to select our Lambda function, which is disable-mfa. And then we want to go through and set everything like we have been. So under method response, expand this, we're going to add a header, access-control-allow-origin, with a capital O. So save that. Going back to integration response, we can then expand this. Under header mappings, we see the same header. We want to add a value, which is a wildcard surrounded by single quotes. We want to save this and go back. Method request, authorization will be Cognito to make sure the users are logged in. We want to validate everything, the body, the query string parameters, and the headers. And then we want to set API key required to true. Now under the URL query string parameters, we want to have access to the user code, and we want to have access to the access token. We don't have to specify the sub in here because we can gain access to that through a different way that's automatically passed in through API gateway. These should be required though. If we go back to our method request, we can go to integration request, mapping templates, create a new one whenever none are defined. I'm going to add a mapping template as application JSON. Clicking the check mark, we can create a JSON-like syntax here. Access token will be input.params. And then access token, we can copy this. We're going to paste in user code right here. So this is the same stuff as we've seen before. Now to gain access to the sub, we need to do sub and then $context.authorizers.claims.sub. Make sure to add a comma here. We can click on save. And actually this should be authorizer, not authorizers. So we can click on save again. Scrolling up, we can go to actions and deploy the API to our development stage. Now we can go back to our code here. We want to go to MFA, and then we want to get access to the session, which returns a promise. And we're then going to get our headers and our access token similar to before. If type of access token is not exactly equal to string, or let's say access token equals access token.jwt token. And then we can create a URI. This is going to use the API, which is the variable we created before, very similar stuff to what we've been doing. And then we're going to have our access token, which will equal our access token. And we're also going to have our user code equal our user code. We're going to console log the URI, and then we're going to fetch. We're going to pass in the URI, which is our target, and our method will be delete, because that's the type of endpoint we just created. We're going to pass in our headers, and then we can use .then to get some data. We're going to convert that to JSON, which returns its own promise. So .then console.log, .catch console.error. So if we save this, we go back to our website, we see MFA is already enabled, which is what we expect, but we have this input here to be able to actually disable MFA. So if I open up the thing, we can go to our code. We see 500.791. Yours will be different, obviously. Okay, so we see an access denied exception. So if we expand this, we hover over this, we say, disable MFA is not authorized to perform Cognito admin set user MFA preference. So we can easily fix this using IAM. So we can go to services, select IAM, open that in a new tab. We can go to policies. We're going to create a new policy. The service will be Cognito user pools, which you can search Cognito and then select this one right here. Under write, we want admin set user MFA preference, which we see right here. We can check that. Now we need to specify what resource we want to actually edit. So we can go to our user pools. Under general settings, we see our pool ARN. We can copy that. Going back, we can add the ARN and paste this in right here. We can then click on add and then review the policy. So we're going to call this policy Cognito tutorial edit MFA. So we can then click on create policy. Okay, now that has been created, we need to actually attach that to a role. So we're going to go over to our roles. We're going to create one. This will be for Lambda. So we're going to go to our next permissions. I'm going to search for CloudWatch, which is a very basic role or policy I have to just allow me to do anything with CloudWatch. So for example, add things to logs. And then we're also going to search for Cognito tutorial, which is the thing we just created. We're going to select that. We're going to ignore the tags. And I like to name these the exact same name as the Lambda function that's going to use them. So I'll just copy and paste that in. We can then create the role. Going back to Lambda, we can go to the permissions tab. We see it's currently Lambda default, but if we click on edit, and if we scroll down, we see existing roles that's dropped down right here. So if we search for disable MFA, we can select the new role we created and click on save. Going back, if we clear our console and we try again. Okay, so we're still getting an access denied exception, and that's because I actually forgot to fill in the user pool ID here. So it's trying to access a blank user pool. So if we go back to Cognito, we can copy the pool ID. We can paste that in right here. We're going to need to copy all of our code again and go back to our function. Going to the configuration tab and scrolling down, we can paste in our code and we should see the user pool ID populated right there. Control S to save in the template editor, and then we can go into the save button at the top right. Going back, if we clear this and I enter my new code, which is 918.583, when I click disable MFA, we then see an empty object, and if I refresh, we then see enable MFA, which means that it was successfully disabled. So now the last step to do is to require them to enter their MFA token whenever they log in. So I'm going to get rid of my access token on my Google Authenticator app, and I'm going to enable MFA, and I'm going to scan the new code. So entering the new code, we're going to say 362.454, confirm code. MFA is enabled, so that's good. Now if I log out and I refresh the page, I try and log in again. If I click login right here, it says that there's an error because callback.totp required is not a function. So if I copy this, if I go into my account file again, if I scroll down to authenticate, we need to actually handle this right here. And so how I'm going to do this is const token equals prompt. Please enter your 6-digit token. And this is going to ask the user, and they can type that in. And then we're going to access the user object, user.send-mfa code. We're going to pass in the token. We have a object that has some callback variables, and then this is going to be software token MFA. Now this callback, we're going to have on success, which we're simply going to say window.location.href equals itself, which will essentially refresh. And then on failure, we're going to say alert incorrect code. So if I save this and we go back, we try and log in again, it's then going to ask us for a 6-digit token. If we enter an incorrect token, it'll say incorrect code. We try and log in once more and we enter the correct token, which is 420610. It then works and we refresh the page and we're now logged in. It says MFA is enabled and everything is working. So this is a little bit of a setup, but now our entire Google authentication flow using the multi-factor authentication with Cognito is now fully set up and working. Thanks for watching this AWS tutorial. If you need help or have a video request, be sure to leave a comment down below or ask in the Warnoff Keys Discord, which can be found in the video description. If you want to learn more about AWS, consider clicking on one of the videos you see on your screen now.